Hi, my name is David Carr, and I teach at Union Theological Seminary. And I want to give a brief presentation here on how ancient texts were changed with a focus on the primeval history found in the book of Genesis of the Bible, chapters 1 through 11. My primary aim for this presentation is to, first of all, describe two particular ways that we actually know that ancient authors revised their texts. And we know this because we actually have different copies of these texts and we can compare them to each other. And then I want to talk about how we see signs of both of these types of change in chapters 1 through 11 of the book of Genesis. And then third and finally, I will talk a little bit about why this whole question might matter for interpretation of the Bible. Now, I'm going to be starting with what I call documented cases of transmission history. By transmission history, I mean study of the growth of ancient texts over time, how they were changed. And by documented, I mean that in these cases, we actually have separate copies of different ancient texts outside the Bible or involving the Bible, as you'll see. And we can compare those with each other and see how those texts were changed over time. Let me start by one of the most commonly documented forms of textual change in the ancient world, and that is what I'll call supplementing. And the example I'll use comes from the famous Gilgamesh epic of ancient Babylonia. We have this epic in different forms. And one of the most prominent early forms is what is often referred to as the Old Babylonian edition of the Gilgamesh epic. And for our purposes right now, it's not so important to talk about the contents of the epic. It focuses on an ancient hero, Gilgamesh, and his journey to sort of explore what the limits of human life might be. But what's interesting for our purposes is that this epic was famous and often copied and transmitted. And in that process, scribes altered the text in certain crucial ways. And in particular, we see the growth of the epic by the addition of a new prologue to it at the beginning. And then also the addition of a flood narrative represented in pink here, as well as an extra tablet added at the end that focuses on Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu and the journey to the netherworld. This is a tradition that's known from other Babylonian literature, and it's been added to the end of the epic. So this supplementing of the old Gilgamesh epic and revising it in crucial respects produced a new edition of the epic, often referred to as the Standard Babylonian edition of the epic. And this process of supplementing that we see here in the Gilgamesh epic was done with many other ancient texts. It was a way in which scribes updated and expanded on texts that were really important to them in their tradition. One image that I find helpful for sort of visualizing this, and I'll have an image in a minute for the other type of change, is this picture of a pair of jeans that have had patches added to it. Of course, this image doesn't work completely because sometimes patches are added to jeans that have holes in them, and there wasn't really a sense in which the old Gilgamesh epic was wholly had different gaps in it. But what is useful about this image is it shows that you have a whole pair of jeans, in this case, the Old Babylonian Gilgamesh epic, that then gets new material added to it. The pink elements in the diagram or the patches in the picture. And in that way, it's supplemented and expanded to travel through the years further on. Now, let me talk now about a different kind of change that's less commonly documented in the ancient world, but it's important for study of the Bible in ways that I'll make clear in a few minutes. And I'll talk about this under the heading of conflation. Conflation has to do with a case where we have multiple texts that are separate from each other that tell a very similar story. And as you see here in the slide, the example that I'm giving here are actually from the New Testament of the Christian Bible, the Gospels, including the Gospels Mark, Matthew, and Luke, and John as well. I put Mark, Matthew, and Luke together in different shades of brown because these Gospels have much more similar types of material in them. Whereas the Gospel of John, though it overlaps in crucial respects with those three synoptic Gospels, has some more distinctive characteristics. But these represent four different stories of Jesus's career. And what's interesting for our purposes about these texts is that in the late 2nd century, in the 160s probably, a scholar and early church father, Tatian, created a text called the Diatessaron, where he combined these four canonical gospels into one conglomerate story about Jesus. And those are represented by the different color blocks in this diagram, although this diagram does not in any way represent just how complex Tatian's combination of these gospels was. One interesting thing about Tatian's Diatessaron is he didn't actually use all the material in all four gospels. If he had, he would have produced an unreadable text because these four gospels tell so many things the same way. So that, for example, Jesus would have been born twice if Tatian had included everything in these four gospels, or Jesus would have been crucified 4 times. But instead of sort of taking absolutely everything from these four gospels, Tatian selectively appropriated from these canonical gospels in order to create a more readable and coherent narrative. And of course, because John overlapped less with the other gospels than the three, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, interacted with each other, Tatian ended up using a bit more of John, whereas he drew more selectively from Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And the result, interestingly enough, was a combined text that in certain parts of the Syrian church was quoted as scripture in place of those four canonical gospels for a bit over a century, even as the rest of the church kept reading those four gospels separately and ultimately condemned Tatian's Diatessaron as a heretical text, and it was destroyed in most copies and can only be reconstructed in a fragmentary way now. But what's interesting about the Diatessaron is it provides an example, one long after the period of the Hebrew Bible, of how an ancient author could take parallel texts that told a similar story and selectively appropriate and combine those different texts into one. And the image that I find helpful for this process of conflation, as opposed to supplement, which I talked about a few minutes ago, is braiding. That is where you have two strands of a narrative that are quite parallel to each other, that are interwoven with each other into a new whole. So now let's look at chapters 1 through 11 in the Bible. Now, in contrast with documented cases of transmission history, we don't actually have earlier documented sources of Genesis 1 to 11, not in the sense of having multiple sources, that sort of thing. Instead, scholars need to work with indicators inside the text to try to reconstruct hypothetically the shape of now lost sources of that text. Indicators include things like shifts in chronology. Within Genesis 1 to 11, for example, you'll see in the flood narrative one set of chronology that seems to work according to different periods in a given year, and another chronology that's not necessarily completely contradictory, but it's different, that focuses on periods of 7 and 40 days. Even more important are ways in which Genesis 1 through 11 feature doubly narrated events. Now, this, of course, doesn't refer to narrations of events that could happen multiple times over a period of time. Say, I might travel to see my family in Atlanta in March, and then in June, and then in November. That kind of thing can certainly be told in one narrative. But instead, I'm talking about double narration of what is essentially the same event. For example, the idea that humans are created, or that the world is created, In theory, at least, humans would only be created once, or there might be only one time that Noah would enter the ark fleeing a flood. And those are interesting because a single author typically would not narrate something like that twice unless they were having someone review and look back on a given event. That certainly happens. And then finally, and this is something one needs to be careful about, is the phenomenon of variation in vocabulary. Now, the most famous one that comes up in the case of Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch has to do with a variation in how God is referred to. There are a number of texts in Genesis 1 to 11 and beyond that tend to use the general Hebrew word for God to refer to God, Elohim. And then there's another set of texts that typically use the Hebrew proper name for God, spelled in consonants YHWH in English. And it's transliterated in many English translations as Lord, all caps. They use that to refer to God and not Elohim. So, of course, there are texts we have where we'll have one author use both designations for God, but this variation is predominant enough that many scholars have found that interesting. And they've used these sorts of variations in divine designation to sort the different doubled narrations of events in Genesis into two sources, one of which uses the word Elohim and one of which uses the divine name to refer to God. And what's important for you to realize is they've also used plenty of other distinctive vocabulary to do that sorting. So this kind of vocabulary variation is an iffy kind of criterion because the same author can use different words at different points. But if you put enough different kinds of vocabulary together, it begins to help you try to piece together the different information you have in the text. So what I'm suggesting you do now, maybe if you can just pause the presentation as soon as I'm done talking, is to look yourself for indicators in Genesis 1 to 11 along these lines, focusing particularly on the flood narrative in chapters 6 through 9. See if you can find places where the same event seems to be narrated twice, or the same figure is introduced twice, or shifts in chronology, or maybe even variations between divine designation and other kinds of vocabulary. Even though scholars have been looking for this for hundreds of years, and in the next slide, I'll talk some about what they've seen, there's something about seeing this kind of thing for yourself that helps you sort of incorporate and reinforce this learning much better than if you only hear me talking about it. So I'd encourage you at this point to either press the space bar or hover over the slide and press the stop and just pause and take a look at your Bible and see if you can find these clues yourself. Be a detective and see if you can see some kinds of indicators or fractures that might indicate to you already how there are some different sources present in these chapters. Okay, so let's take a look now at some of the sorts of things that scholars have seen. First and foremost, lots of doubling across these chapters. It starts with two creation accounts, one in chapter 1 of Genesis and one in chapters 2 through 3. And these creation accounts don't exactly overlap, but they overlap in crucial respects in describing, say, the creation of humans, the creation of animals, and so on. And so that is a clue initially to many scholars that these two creation accounts, which also have lots of distinctive elements to them, were probably originally separate and written by different authors. In addition, when you take a closer look at the genealogies in chapters 4, particularly chapter 4, 17 through 26, and chapter 5, you find that there are a number of names in common, but they don't occur in exactly the same order. And then some of the names aren't exactly the same, but when you look at them, you realize they're actually different versions of the same name. And this indicates that these two chapters probably represent two different forms of a very similar genealogy of primeval ancestors who lived right after creation. And then we really see in chapters 6 through 9 of Genesis evidence of a braiding or conflation of two flood narratives, and they're just basically two narrations of most events. These include two descriptions of God perceiving that there's evil in the world, two descriptions of Noah as an exception to that, and description of him as good or righteous, two announcements by God of the flood to Noah, two commands to Noah for him to enter the ark with others, both members of his family and with at least one pair of every animal. Take a note, though, of which animals are required to be brought into the ark in both cases. They're not the same. Two statements that Noah complied with God's orders. Two descriptions of how he then entered the ark. And two promises by God to Noah after the flood not to ever destroy life again with their own characteristics. These are just some examples of places where the flood narrative features a number of different places where the basic same event in the flood narrative sequence is described twice. And it's an important pointer to many scholars that we see in these flood narratives and more broadly in Genesis 1 through 9, an interweaving, a braiding, a conflation of two originally separate and parallel source strands that once stood separate from one another before they were brought together in our current combined and complex text. So what does this point to? It points for most scholars toward the idea that although we've lost them now, these chapters of Genesis were formed out of two originally separate source strands, which I will term P and non-P, though many scholars will use the term J to refer to the second one. The first likely to be written was the non-priestly primeval history. And this includes, you can look for yourself in these chapters, the story of the Garden of Eden and the first human couple. And it then goes on in chapter 4 of Genesis to talk about the first brothers, Cain and Abel, and Cain's murder of Abel. It includes the promise of Noah's birth in the fragment in chapter 5, verse 29, and then a number of parts of chapters 6 through 8, which are too numerous and complicated to enumerate here, before it goes on to include a story of Noah and his sons and some parts of chapter 10, which is an overview of humanity after the flood, and then the Tower of Babel story. This is all non-priestly primeval history and a section of text that some scholars would refer to as J, because of the letter J was how the German language represented the sound Y, which was the beginning of the Hebrew proper name for God, which is used across this strand. The other major strand that we see here is what I'll call the priestly primeval history, and that term is fairly widely used. And it includes the description of God's creation of the earth in 7 days and God's ceasing of work on the seventh day. It includes the genealogy extending from Adam to Noah in chapter 5. It includes a separate description of the flood narrative across chapters 6 through 9. And it also includes some distinctive priestly elements of the post-flood overview of humanity in chapter 10. So these are the basic contents that are fairly broadly agreed for the source materials that went into our present text of Genesis. But what we have now is not those two source strands separately, but them put together. And right now in this slide, they're still represented separately, but here let me go into another slide that represents some of the complexity of the present combination. What I've done here is to use the same colors that I used in the previous slides, but try to show how these are interwoven or connected to each other, with the light green being the priestly materials and the dark brown being the non-priestly or J materials. So you can see the 7-day creation account in Genesis 1 at the outset. And then the person who combined these texts inserted material from the non-priestly material, a big block, including the Garden of Eden story and the story of Cain and Abel and the genealogy of Cain's descendants and also then Adam and Eve's other child, Seth, and his descendants. And then the compiler or conflator of these texts inserted a large block of P in Genesis 5, represented in light green, along with that little brown fragment that represents a part of non-P about Noah that occurs in chapter 5, verse 29. And then it's really difficult to graphically represent just how complex the interweaving becomes in chapters 6 through 9. I've done a part of that through showing more blocks present in this material. But in any case, you see a mix of the two before you see P again in a big block in chapter 9, 1 to 17, with the instructions about eating animals and also the rainbow covenant, before you get the overview of post-flood humanity and the story of Noah and his sons in chapters 9:18 through 11:27. Notice here I've also added a dark red element that represents the material that was specifically added by the person who brought these two strands together. There probably were a number of other elements, but I've just included a few dots here and there to represent the fact that the person who put this material together also played a role in writing new material to help that mix happen. And so this slide just sort of represents how complex the ultimate result was from this conflation of two source strands. And this is, again, a form of braiding of two originally separate and parallel narrative materials. Now, you may look at that and think, how could people ever have come up with that? And it is quite something. But I would just want to affirm before I move on to evidence of another type of growth in these chapters, that this basic picture of P and non-P materials is actually a scholarly consensus that's been established over a period of over a century. It starts with Jean Astruc in 1753, who identified the overall outlines of P and non-P sources of Genesis while he was working as a doctor in the court of King Louis XIV in France. Astruc's basic insight into sources of Genesis was then refined and extended to the rest of the Pentateuch by others, particularly German scholars, such as Eberhard Schrader, represented here, who wrote his book in 1863, and Theodor Noldeke, who wrote his book in 1869. Remarkably enough, the basic definition of P that Noldeke in particular put together based on the work of Schrader and Astruc and others, that basic identification has proven remarkably durable over the decades and even century and a half since Noldeke wrote, so that even though scholars continue to refine and debate the fine points of defining P, they basically agree. And then by implication, they agree on the material that's not assigned to the priestly source. So this represents a reliable scientific result among scholars who find all sorts of other things to disagree with each other about. And if we try to think about other well-established scientific discoveries of the late 1800s, they'd include things like Charles Darwin's publication in 1859 on the origin of the species, which introduced the idea of biological evolution, or Pasteur's discovery of germs in 1862, things that we sort of take for granted as part of a broader scientific consensus and are taught in schools as sort of old science in many ways. Well, that's also true for this distinction between P and non-P. It's extremely solid and reliable ongoing result of biblical research. And it's something useful to remember because there are plenty of other things that biblical scholars disagree about. But here we have something where even though the sources of P and non-P have been forever lost and we have no separate copies of them, scholars have been able to use clues within the text of Genesis to reconstruct them. Now, let me talk about a case that's a little bit more questionable, but it's interesting because it might be an example within Genesis 1 to 11 of that other common type of ancient textual revision, supplement. And in this case, I'm raising a possibility already raised in the late 1800s that the non-P flood narrative may have been added as a supplement to the rest of the non-P primeval history. You see this diagrammed in the diagram below, where you see in dark brown the outlines of what might have been an earlier non-P primeval history. One that started with the story of the first human couple in the Garden of Eden and continued to their two sons, Cain and Abel, in Genesis 4, and a genealogy of Cain, and then them having another son. And it would have concluded with the story of Noah and his sons that's found in the latter part of Genesis 9, and possibly an outline of a couple more sons, grandsons of Noah. In any case, whatever the shape of that earlier non-P primeval history, there are signs that the flood narrative that comes between the story of Adam and Eve's first children and the story of Noah and his sons may have been a later addition to it, albeit one that was written in light of the material surrounding it and written to fit in some way to that broader narrative stretch. It still has enough distinctive characteristics that I and a few other scholars think it might have been added. These include the fact that the flood narrative is described as wiping out all of human life except for Noah and his immediate family, which would then mean that the culture founders that are introduced in chapter 4, verses 20 to 22, who found various things like music and city dwelling, these culture founders would have been wiped out too, and there'd be no point in talking about them. This doesn't seem like something one single author would have written for themselves. In addition, there's some distinctive differences between the way the flood narrative is structured and how it's focused and the whole rest of the non-P primeval history. One example is that where most non-P primeval stories focus on individual family dynamics, indeed they sort of pursue the three major relationships in a primary family, that between the couple, between the siblings, and between the parent and the children. The flood narrative sort of plops down in the middle of it and focuses on humanity as a whole. And then there are various other important differences as well that I won't go into now, but I'm just trying to provide an example. And then finally, Noah is really a somewhat different character in both materials. This isn't impossible, but it might be an indicator that the flood narrative was added later. Within what I'm calling the older primeval history, Noah is a farmer, and he's a founder of viticulture, that is the growing of wine, in chapter 9, 20 to 27. Whereas in the flood narrative, he's the flood hero. He's the counterpart to ancient Mesopotamian flood narratives within the Israelite text. So as I've emphasized throughout, these kinds of things are iffier. After all, when somebody's adding to an existing text, with that in mind from the beginning, they may not be trying to hide their traces, but they're also going to be aware of how what they're adding fits into the broader narrative. And they'll work on making sure that what they add to that narrative makes pretty good sense. And that then means that whatever is added is going to be a lot tougher for later people to detect, purely on the basis of a later text in its supplemented form. And this helps explain why scholars who are working with the Bible have so much more trouble achieving the kind of lasting and specific consensus on how many supplements were added to the Bible and where than they have achieved in the case of identifying P and non-P sources across Genesis and other Pentateuchal books. But in any case, back to our image. If we're talking about supplementing here, the way to picture this might be that it's sort of like this image of patching, where the non-P flood narrative in this case is the added material, whereas the older non-P primeval history is the pair of genes that you started with. So in conclusion, what do we do with all this sort of talk about now lost sources that can be reconstructed more or less based on data within the present text? One of the first things it can do for us is it can tune us into the distinctively different voices that are present within the text. Often, as people have worked through these chapters of Genesis, they've tried to harmonize and try to explain, for example, why humans could be created in a certain order vis-a-vis animals in Genesis 1, and then be created in a different order in Genesis 2. And they've spent a lot of time trying to sort of merge these two and overcome those contradictions. But when we realize that these are actually distinctively different source strands that were originally written to be separate from one another, we can hear each of them for themselves and not try to explain away their distinctive characteristics. We can enhance and be in touch with them. In addition, we can appreciate all the more the way the present text is a complex combination of those different voices. We can start to envision how the biblical text is in many ways more of a duet than a solo, and appreciate the majesty and power of that. The people who created this text didn't want to leave either of these two sources aside, but wanted to include them both in a complex combination, and found that combination more powerful than either of these two strands by themselves would have been. And perhaps it can also help us start to imagine, if you're working within a religious or theological context, new, more creative possibilities for interacting with the text. We can begin to appreciate, say, how the Bible is not the creation of one and only one author whose single perspective we must then adopt, but to begin to imagine, if we're talking theologically, about the canonical text as being more like a relay race. To take up the image that you might have perceived in the background of these slides, you can see a track runner who could be imagined being in a relay race where one author passes a baton to another, who might be another author of a source strand or a conflator or a supplement, who then takes that text further into the years. And as we start to imagine the text along those lines as a dynamic combination of different voices over time, it becomes more possible for us to imagine interacting with that as part of that ongoing dialogue, even if nobody's going to include our interpretations of the Bible or poetic reflections in the next NRSV or other published version. So I hope that this presentation has proven helpful to you, and it can help you see the possibilities of recognizing, in terms of clues of the text, how there are different kinds of voices embedded in it that have been combined over time. This whole presentation was designed not purely as a sort of advertisement for my textbook, but if you're interested in some more information, it accompanies that. You see a picture on the left of the second edition of my Hebrew Bible, A Contemporary Introduction to the Christian Old Testament and Jewish Tanakh, or the combination of an abbreviated version of that material with an introduction to the New Testament in the co-authored introduction by Colleen, Conway, and myself of A Contemporary Introduction to the Bible. And I wish you the best as you continue learning.